Right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second CEFAW webinar, How Defarmed Animals Flourish. Very pleased to have you all here this afternoon. This is the second in a series of webinars. The first one was in January, and we've got third and fourth ones on the 10th of March and the 14th of April. So you're all very welcome to come to any or all of those. And we're very pleased today to welcome Dr. David Grummett from the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. Oops. Yep, and Professor Siobhan Mullen from the School of Veterinary Medicine at University College Dublin. So yeah, the webinar will go on until about 2 o'clock. We'll begin with a presentation by Siobhan and then from David. And you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen a question and answer box. So please feel free to add some questions in there. Questions to either of the presenters, and then we'll come to those either at the end of each presentation or in the second half of the webinar when we hope to have a lot of time for discussion. Let me first introduce Siobhan. Siobhan is Chair in Animal Welfare and Veterinary Ethics at the School of Veterinary Medicine at Dublin, and after a very kind of successful period at Bristol Vet School, recently moved from. And Siobhan has been a key part of the project from the outset, bringing a lot of kind of really valuable expertise in animal welfare. And so without further ado, let me hand you over to Siobhan.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'll just get my slides organised so that you can see them. Okay, so it's really a great pleasure to be able to talk to you a little bit, especially about one of my most favourite topics, which is what animals really enjoy in life and the sorts of environments that we could give them to help them do that. It's been such a pleasurable experience to engage in this project, which I have to say for welfare scientists is quite an unusual form of collaboration between theology and sort of natural sciences, but it's really very stimulating and interesting. Okay, so thinking about animals then, I guess the way that I think about things is really in terms of, in the main, a sort of a biological functioning, which is being honed through the process of evolution over, well, millennia and beyond. So just thinking about these wild boar here, for example, here they are in their natural habitat. So it's a woodland setting, and it's you can see sort of around them these sort of little bits of grass that they've kind of rooted up, where they're looking literally for roots and other edible things. They are in a little clearing there. They're in a small family group, which is how they tend to be. And the physiological mechanisms, I suppose, for enabling their survival can be sort of thought of as things that provide positive experiences. So those would be things that are essentially evolutionarily beneficial. So in this case, things like finding tasty food. The reason that we've got the ability to taste and enjoy foods is because these are the types of foods that have been found to help us survive over a long period of time. So in this case, for example, these boars, they will root and they will find the most tasty and the most nutritious food, and they're also highly driven to keep rooting even in the, when times are really hard. And of course, it'll be those boars in previous generations that rooted the hardest that eventually found something that was nutritious for them and able them to survive, a difficult winter or something like that. And then on the sort of flip side, I guess we've got, potential negative experiences. So, for example, perhaps the most obvious one is the experience of pain, and the mechanism for that probably serves a number of functions. It serves to help us learn and not repeat the same, for example, risky activity or whatever it was that got us into that pain in the first place. It might serve to protect the painful area of the body and so on. So all of these things have helped shape us and animals, and in a way you can think of kind of quality of life or welfare in terms of this balance of these positive and negative experiences. So when we're kind of perhaps more formally trying to make assessments of welfare, and then thinking in particular about when animals really are flourishing, I guess we are trying to do this sort of balancing act. And one of the most tricky things is that we might be trying to do that at any one period of time. So we might be trying to, weigh up enjoying watching, a funny TV show whilst at the same time actually having a broken leg. So how are those two things kind of coming into play at that one moment in time? Or equally kind of over the whole life of an animal. So, here we've got, for example, the little chick on the left, just starting off in life, found a worm. I mean, if any of you have seen chicks with worms, this is truly the highlight for them. This is absolutely, kind of epitome of pleasure and excitement. And there's even something called a worm run that they will do, which is kind of this very specific sort of darting movement where they run off because it's such a kind of highly favoured resource that they've found. Versus on the right here, we've got a chicken that's died in an intensive broiler shed. It's got its leg in the air, and on the foot pad you can see is a horrible sort of bit of mud and crud, and I can assure you if you sort of broke that muddy, that kind of crud away, there'd be a big kind of sore underneath there as well. So that animal has suffered almost certainly prior to death, not least from that sore foot, but also probably for the thing that's actually caused it to die, because the sore foot was likely not the cause. So it's probably been ill and then it's died. So these are really tricky things to do, thinking about animals' lives kind of in the whole. But we do try and do that, and we know a lot from many different types of studies of the sorts of things that animals do enjoy, and also the sorts of things that make them suffer. And so in the end, ultimately, we're thinking about animals in terms of flourishing when that balance is really kind of heavily in the positive side. So they're having lots of positive experiences. Here's a little band of hens with their cockerel. So they're in a sort of typical group that would be found in the natural setting. So the type of social group that they've evolved to be in. They're foraging and scratching around, which again is something that they spend a lot of time doing. And they look in good condition and so on. So we can't see any particular evidence in this photo of any negative experiences that they are having. I guess one thing that I would just like to note at this stage, that a life without any negative experiences actually may not be the best life available. So we do know that actually small amounts of stress are actually quite beneficial for animals and humans, in terms both kind of in physical terms, but also in terms of building things like resilience for the future, being as a way to help them overcome the challenges that they may face in the rest of their life, and so on. So a life without stress is probably not necessarily what we're trying to aim for. But I think, kind of a chronic, unrelenting low level of stress is not very desirable. And also, severe stressors can be really negative experiences, and we can often see the effects of those negative experiences for a long period of time afterwards, and sometimes even for whole life. So, for example, some of the when young animals are caused pain, for example, by some of the procedures that we might do on them, like disbudding and so on, then we see that the way that they respond to pain throughout their life, many months later even, is kind of much more exaggerated, and it appears that pain in very early life has even sort of primed them. So that wouldn't be something that we'd, that wouldn't be the type of negative experience that would be ultimately positive. Okay, so thinking about chickens then, here's a natural wild jungle fowl in a little clearing in a jungle, but again they live in woodland, a bit like the pigs. They were very well adapted to a complex environment. They eat lots of different types of food. They live in small family groups. They would have 1 or 2 clutches of eggs a year. And they, like all of our animals actually that we currently farm, although we've really changed how these animals look and how fast they grow and how many eggs they produce and so on, actually we've barely changed their sort of natural behaviour. So if you set any of our wild animals into a sort of semi-wild setting and then observe them really closely, their behavioural repertoire is basically exactly the same as the wild counterparts, and they start to reorganise themselves into very similar social groups and spending all of their time foraging and so on. And here's a hen with her chicks in a this is an owned hen in a commercial, well, probably backyard setting, but here she is foraging. Hens and chickens spend almost all of their time foraging. The chicks even are starting to do that. These are only a day or 2 old, and they're happily around her, sort of engaging that behaviour, learning from her and being encouraged by her to do this, in fact. One of the things that chickens really love to do, and they place a high value on the being able to do it, is dust bathe. So when the conditions are right, they will dust bathe about every other day on average, keeping their feathers in good condition, and we know that this induces positive emotions in them. And chickens also really like to perch higher up when given the opportunity at night. They would naturally fly up into the low branches of trees, and so they have this kind of very strong natural instinct to go up at night. So here's some hens on a commercial free-range farm. They are foraging, scratching around. They've got trees that have been planted, which you can see. They've got clover and all sorts, and they're very well feathered, and they look great, to be honest. Here's what the inside of the shed may look like on that farm or another sort of similar free-range farm. So once you get inside the shed, they normally are pretty packed in, but basically the more attractive you can make the range, the more likely the birds are to go out and spend a lot of time out on the range. And we know that the birds really do enjoy ranging, and it really promotes their welfare in a number of different ways. But they are also sometimes put off from ranging for a number of reasons. So, for example, if there's not cover overhead like trees and so on, it just feels like a very daunting big open space for them to go to. If the ground outside the pop holes is very muddy and so on, then it can be difficult too for them. And their food is also inside. So and the nesting areas and so on. So there are things that they need to be inside to access. And so again, that's something that you know, finding the balance for them between in or out is important. Here's a hen, which could be on a free-range farm, which has had its beak trimmed. So about 90% of hens in the UK have their beaks trimmed. So the top of the beak there has been trimmed back when the hen was about a day old, and the bottom one is just as normal. It's an infrared beam is used, and probably now is not very painful. In the old days, it was sort of a physical thing and was probably more likely to be painful. This is what a normal hen's beak would look like. So the top beak would come right over the top into a little point. And the reason that this is done is to prevent one hen pecking the feathers out of another hen. And the reason that a hen will do that is essentially because the environment that she has is inadequate to encourage her to forage in the normal way. And then she has this very strong desire, exactly like I explained with the pigs, that they have this very strong desire to keep foraging. Even when you provide them with food, it's kind of hardwired in there, and they will essentially forage on other birds and will peck and pull feathers out, and you know create damage to the birds as well. So even on free-range farms, many birds will be beak trimmed. We've also got about 50% of our birds which are in cages, and these are colony cages allowed in the EU. So there's a nest box at the end, and there will be a little scratching pad, which isn't in this photo, but there's very, very restrictive environment. So here's the kind of, you know, your typical free-range farm. And I guess, you know, there's some really great farms out there. But perhaps behind the scenes, one of the things to remember is that it's only the females that go forward in this system, because we've really started to breed very specialised animals. And this will be something that we'll see again with cattle, that the hens that lay eggs are kind of very thin, dainty birds, which just, you know, put all their energy into laying eggs, whereas the birds that we want for meat are much heavier and so on. And so the males now in this system are considered useless, not economic to produce, and they are killed when they are a day old. There are ways forward in the future in terms of looking at sexed eggs as a way forward, but not currently. Okay, so here is a typical broiler shed in the UK. Probably about 90% of birds are kept like this. They grow to about 40 days of age, and then they're slaughtered. It's a very uncomplex environment. If you think of, you know, what the birds would be used to and the sorts of things that would make them enjoy life, that they've evolved to enjoy in the wild, you know, that really complex environment, lots of different foods and so on. This is really couldn't be more different, to be honest. And here males and females would be grown. Even an organic bird like this is, you can start to see the very extreme muscling, and there are kind of several health issues that can be related to these meat chickens now, because they just grow so fast, their legs can be very weak and their hearts are not too strong either, and that's a big cause of mortality. And here's a kind of higher welfare indoor system. It's got a veranda on the side, it's got these bales of hay which they will grow on, and these will be slower growing birds. These would be the sorts of birds that you would see in an, for example, RSPCA assured label. And then this is more of a typical of an organic meat bird setting, so they're probably pasture, maybe woodland in some instances, but small sheds, and the sheds can often move around so that they've always got good pasture and it doesn't get completely denuded away. Okay, so coming on to pigs now. We've seen the wild boar already. Here's some piglets absolutely loving playing. They really enjoy play at all ages, but particularly when they're young. And then this would be very typical. About 70% of UK sows are kept inside and are farrowing in these farrowing crates, which really are one of the most restrictive forms of animal enclosure that we have. So for about 4 weeks, the sow will be kept in this sort of box that all they can do is stand up and lie down, and the piglets are able to get out to the side. They were introduced to try and improve piglet mortality as essentially if the sows lay down quickly, then piglets could be crushed. And there's some evidence that well, they certainly found it beneficial when they introduced them, but now we know a bit more about the sorts of things that actually lead to that mortality. And the natural behaviour of the sow is to spend about a minute turning round and round, signalling with a very special grunt to the piglets that, you know, I'm gonna lie down, watch out, I'm gonna lie down. And that's something that we haven't been selecting for a long period of time now. But actually, when you go back and do that or look at outdoor sows, then they will actually have very low levels of mortality. We often have to dock the tails of piglets, so this is a painful procedure. The pig farmers will justify it by saying that it prevents tail biting in the future, which is really, I mean, it is terrible when it happens, but the reason it's happening is exactly the same as the chickens. The pigs are kept in a very barren environment. They're programmed to root, and they basically go and chew each other's tails. And it can be, you know, it is a significant cause of loss, but essentially the problem is the environment, not so much the animal. So here's some pigs outside, and here the sows would be, this is an organic paddock, the sows would be giving birth in those arcs. The piglets would be able to go in and out and mix together as they started to get older with a lot more freedom. And then as the piglets that we saw in the farrowing crate start to grow, they will probably be kept somewhere like this, so without any straw or anything around. So about 60% of our growing pigs are kept without straw. This very barren environment. They probably just have something like this chain and so on to chew on. About 40% are kept on straw, so here they are in some small pens, and they will have the ability then to root in straw. And if they're really lucky, pigs absolutely love to wallow. They can't regulate the temperature very well themselves without the opportunity to get wet and evaporate. And so, yeah, they really enjoy a muddy wallow. Just thinking about cattle, here's some Chillingham cattle, which are a herd that have been sort of almost untouched over many, many years in the UK. So we know a lot about their behaviour over in the wild. And of course, grazing is a big part of life for cattle. They in the wild would spend almost all of their time basically grazing, chewing the cud, or resting. And then this would be a very typical housing environment for cattle, which probably most cows are in over winter right now, and about 10% of cows will be in something like this all year round in the UK. The alternative to indoor housing in cubicles that we've just seen is something like a straw yard, which gives a lot more freedom and choice and a more comfortable lying environment. In the dairy sector, of course, we're taking the milk, so the calves are taken away from the cows within a day, or just a few days usually, and then they might be kept something like this, either singly or maybe in pairs, but the legislation only requires them to have sight and touch through these bars with another calf in the early weeks. We might do something like disbudding that we talked about earlier, which can cause pain. That's so that they don't have horns. And then eventually they'll go on and be in groups reared for meat. Usually it's about 50% of the beef in the UK comes from the dairy sector. But an alternative system is a calf at foot system, or cow-calf dairying as it's known. So here's some Jersey cows with their calves, so they'll be milked as well as the calves taking the milk. And there's a number of different ways that this can be done. Sometimes the calves might be separated off at night, and then the cows milked first thing in the morning, and then the calves able to have the rest of the milk. And certainly the cows have plenty of milk for us and them, as it were. So yeah, this is something that's growing interest, and certainly much more welfare friendly. But of course, the amount of milk that it's producing for the humans is less. Cows love to do things like scratch. They will play, calves will play, and so on. And I guess the thing that we might provide for them to scratch on, if we don't give them much opportunity in their natural environment, would be something like this brush, which they really value, and they really enjoy to go and rub up against, and it will rotate. This is a typical suckler herd in the UK, so cows and calves kept together out at pasture, and yeah, quite a high proportion of our beef calves are reared in this suckler-based system. But then in winter, they're likely to be housed. Not all, but they will likely be housed, and sometimes this is poor quality housing, but I would say not that untypical. And so that, you know, there's definitely room for improvement in winter housing of beef cattle. Sheep lead a very kind of naturalistic life compared to some of our other species. So the wild sheep would be in small family groups. They're quite light. There'd be natural shearing and so on. Here we might have indoor lambing or outdoor lambing. This is a very typical indoor lambing scenario with pens set up. Then probably the ewes and lambs will go outside. The lambs may be tail docked or castrated, potentially with a rubber ring. We know this is painful and sets them up, as I said before, for sort of feeling more pain later on in life. And the reason that this is done is to try and prevent fly strike. If there's a build-up of feces around the tail end, then flies will come. And again, this is a very horrible thing to try and prevent. And so certainly it's often seen as a benefit, but it's, I guess, part of the environment that we're keeping them in. So here's the maternal care provided by the ewes and the lambs. We know that this is something that's really pleasurable for both the mothers and the offspring, pretty much in all mammalian species and in birds as well. Conditions can be tough, and so sometimes they're having to, you know, really struggle in quite a naturalistic environment, and that this may not be, they may not be experiencing the best emotions at this stage. Sheepdogs can be a source of fear. They can be used appropriately and, you know, very usefully, but essentially the reason they work is through inducing fear, which is obviously a negative experience in a prey animal. And finally, to fish. I'm going to just only mention salmon, and just to say something about what we know about fish, which is hugely less than for our other species. So we know that they feel pain, they are sentient in that sense, but we don't really know much about pleasure or other types of negative experiences of fish. There's very little experimental evidence that's been done about them, and likely mostly this is a lack of evidence rather than evidence of a lack of emotion, if you see what I mean. But this is where we are. They're also very recently domesticated, so really in the last kind of 70 years or so, unlike the thousands of years for the other species. They have these thousands and thousands of tiny alevin, these babies, and there's a very interesting question with them about whether they are actually sentient at this stage. They're almost considered larval, and it's not clear that they are, for example, conscious, and it may be that they sort of develop that sentience over the first 20 days while this yolk sac disappears. Of course, they're currently kept very commonly in these big sea pens, and with a number of different problems. One of the biggest things is that they're very overcrowded in them, and you can't attend to any individuals, and even in open seawater it can be difficult to maintain good water quality. basically they can be handled for a number of different reasons, and each one of those is stressful for them. And that's all I wanted to say really on that, and I'd be happy to take any questions and have a discussion about any of those points a bit later. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Siobhan. Yeah, we've had some really good questions into the chat. So we've logged those, but what we're going to do now is hand straight over to David, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion with all of the questions in a little while. So introducing David Grummett from the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Paul. Siobhan has given us a really useful species by species account of what flourishing consists of. I thought in just about 10 minutes before we move to the discussion time, I would try to give a generic overview of some things we should be thinking about across species that promote flourishing and why they're important, really based on thinking about what farmed animals are and how they're distinctive from other kinds of animal, and how we can work with the ways that they naturally live. So firstly, farmed animals are group animals. If they weren't, it wouldn't really be viable for us to farm them, because we'd have to have sort of one there, one over there, one somewhere else, and we would never be able to have them in sufficient numbers for farming to be a viable enterprise. It's right, absolutely, that we look at the welfare of individuals, but the welfare of the individual typically depends on their place in the group. Groups are structured. Structure usually comes from females, and disrupting this structure can be the source of a lot of behavioural problems in modern farming systems. In contrast with females, males may spend time away from the herd in the wild, or a bit removed from it. But particularly if the males are all put together in a farming system, that can cause problems. Animal groups may rely on tradition and learned behaviour, things like where to find food in different seasons of the year and migration routes. So this group identity really provides a context for stability and learning and mutual support. Animals, like all living beings, have a sex life. Sexual interactions and attachments are part of their life. Almost all the species we farm are promiscuous. Grey-lag geese are probably the exception. So that means that they tend to mate with multiple partners over their life. Having males and females together can have sort of positive effects on female fertility, helping bring females into estrus in some species, and males also develop the capability, or have the capability, to detect females when they are in estrus. And same-sex activity is also part of farmed animal life, as it is part of human life. Natality too. I've been amazed to learn about some of the synchronization abilities of animals, synchronization of sort of gestation and birth. Some groups of cows have been shown to have the ability to have a convergent birth date for their young, and perhaps even more cleverly, chicks are able through tapping and signalling when they're still within the shell as embryos to adjacent embryos to synchronize hatching. So having animals of roughly the same age, or at least less difference in the age range than there would otherwise be, is likely to help their socialization and even their survival. Nesting, as Siobhan mentioned, really important in hens, also in pigs. Selection of a nest site in the wild. Pigs may travel several kilometers for this. Then the building of the nest, if we think of the sort of softness of a nest in comparison with a hard surface, issues around crushing with pigs, it seems to me, are likely to be reduced in a nest in the wild versus being on a hard surface. We saw those awful farrowing crates earlier. And also nursing, a natural behaviour that both dams, that is mothers, and young benefit from. Maybe a bit less so in pigs, but in most species, it's really important for the dams, the mothers, to be caring for their young, and for the young to be responding to that. It's hardwired as part of normal behaviour. Siobhan mentioned that sheepdogs are typically viewed as hostile and even as predators. Stock persons have sometimes, it's been argued, are viewed as predators essentially by animals. But I think we can also see another way of understanding the relationship between stock persons and animals much more positively, almost as conspecifics. The human stock person as in some sense a part of the animal group, forming part of a single community. If the stock person has a vocation for that role, has empathy for the animals, I would want to argue that relationships with humans can actually enrich animals. After all, if all these farmed animals were suddenly turned out into the wild, many of them would have difficulty surviving. Animal flourishing is also embodied in modern farming systems, as has again been mentioned. There's a tendency to cut off bits of animals for reasons that might have sort of short-term justifications, but often point to deeper problems within a system. And from a high welfare perspective, one would want to be looking at how the system itself can be improved. So tails serve a range of functions in different species. In sheep, some species in the Middle East have developed very big tails that serve as a storage reserve for energy in winter. Tails in some species can help posture, rectal function, and locomotion. They can protect other body parts through keeping them warm. They can also be used to sort of swish flies off the body. They can be part of mating rituals, and they can be indicators of contentment. So something like a tail has so many different potential functions. We really need to think carefully before we justify sort of chopping it off, when actually doing something like changing the feed an animal's having, or changing the environment it's in, might radically reduce the need for tail docking. Horns, they look good, don't they? So yes, they're important for helping sort of indicate hierarchy within a group structure. Structure is good in an animal group because it aids stability. Not hierarchy, not suggesting sort of bullying or exploitation of some animals by others, but actually as a stable group where animals know their place and support each other within that structure. Horns also useful for thermoregulation, so getting rid of heat, functioning a bit like a radiator. It's been shown that the sheep breeds with the largest horns tend to be in hotter climates. Snouts and beaks are the body parts we have a habit of interfering with. Important for grazing, rooting, and pecking. If the dove that brought the olive twig back to Noah's Ark had been beak trimmed, would it have been able to do that? Maybe not, because it might have had difficulty holding the twig in its mouth. Habitat, it's been mentioned, ranging by by pigs and hens, sometimes across quite wide areas. Habitat needs to be spacious enough for the number of animals in it, also appropriate substrate, so dust bathing, hens particularly like fine grained materials for that. Goats need places they can rise up, they like to browse sort of wooden stems, and animals taking their food in a natural way. This is a major part of how they spend their time. So if we remove that ability to forage or graze naturally and just sort of give them a load of concentrate which they can wolf down in a relatively short space of time, the question then arises, what do they spend the rest of their time doing? And this can lead to sort of stereotypical behaviours, problems within animal groups. Animals have incredible route finding abilities in some cases. We know that salmon and trout, which are often farmed in relatively small water enclosures, migrate many hundreds of kilometres, and they're so sophisticated they can even get back to the same exact location for spawning. So going out from there, relatively unsophisticated, because it doesn't matter exactly where they end up, but going back, a whole range of mechanisms used, including sensing the Earth's electromagnetic fields, maybe looking at some stars, smells, remembering cues from when they went out, a whole range of possible factors here. But how clever it is that they can get back in some cases to exactly where they started. And if we go back on land now with hens, like many birds, including those who don't migrate, they seem to have an uncanny route finding ability. It used to be thought this was due to sort of metal particles in the beak area, but it's now being suggested that they have some kind of ability to sort of see magnetic fields. Play also is of course important to animals, play being something that might have useful functions, but also might not. It's important, seems to me, that if we're wanting to promote high welfare, we're not just promoting something because it leads to something else, but we're promoting something just because it's a good in itself, even if it's superfluous. And finally, allowing animals to live long enough that they can exercise their capacities through to adulthood. It does seem to me, though, a bit unrealistic that we sometimes have these very high numbers quoted for normal farmed animal lifespan, that normal in the sense of how long they might live for on a farm if they weren't slaughtered. It seems to me that it'd be more realistic to compare with typical lifespan in the wild, where animals would be subject to a range of limitations on lifespan, such as availability of food, predation, disease. So whereas in farming we should be promoting, I think, a decent lifespan, I wouldn't say we should be promoting a maximum lifespan beyond that which richer species would enjoy in the wild. So I hope that generic summary has been useful to complement Siobhan's species-specific analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That's been that's been fascinating. Thank you, everybody, for questions in the chat as well. I'm going to go back to a couple of the earlier ones, which are related, I think. So one, I think, was slightly a comment about one of Siobhan's slides and like photographs I think you had of chickens, free range, and caged chickens, I think. But I think it's a question of how we can kind of observe or measure animal welfare. And then I think that connects to another question about how, as consumers, we can tell which products come from farmed animals with better lives, better welfare. Do you want to talk to that at all, Siobhan?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, I mean, there is now, a huge body of evidence around animal experiences, particularly for farmed animals, probably the most developed. So I think, at the most base level, in a way, the more biologically similar animals are to us, and this is something that we can very easily determine, then it's very likely that some of the more, I guess, kind of base type of emotions are likely to be transferable, or equivalent in some way across a lot of species. So something like pain. There's just a huge amount of research on this across all sorts of species in every way from the most kind of detailed laboratory understanding, the neurotransmitters that are involved and all of these other things. So there's a huge evidence for something like that. And then we can map that onto the behaviours that we observe. So even something like the grimace face in rats is basically the same as in babies, is the same as in other animals as well. And likewise, there's a sort of pleasure face as well in neonates, and it's the same in rat pups, it's the same in babies. So these are kind of really fundamental, like I was talking about those positive and negative pathways, are kind of really, really deep down in our physiology. But then, I mean, the ways that we look at these things in practice is through a number of different mechanisms. So, we observe animals' behaviour, and we either know through other experiments that these are something that's associated with positive. So, for example, environments that animals choose, and then we see their behaviours in them. Or we might look at things like health records, for example. So, low levels of lameness in dairy cows, or pododermatitis like we saw in the dead chicken, and these would all be indicators of low levels of negative things. And then in terms of systems, the way that you can tell in the shops is really through labelling. So we've got, in this country, we're really lucky to have really well developed farm assurance schemes, and we've actually got kind of different levels that these are operating at. So probably the highest welfare, pretty much across the board, is delivered through organic schemes, and then RSPCA assured would be probably just a little bit below that, and then more standard level welfare, kind of roughly more in line with legislation, a bit above, would be a red tractor.
Great, thank you very much. That leads me on to another question, actually, which I'll put to both of you, but perhaps if David would like to start. I should have mentioned that as well as being a senior lecturer in theological ethics, David sits on the Animal Welfare Committee, is that right, of DEFRA? So this is a question really about what would farmers need to be able to change some of these practices that we're talking about, whether that's tail docking, disbudding, and I know Sean, obviously, Siobhan, you work with farmers as well. But David, what about farmers? How would we?
Well, this is a huge question. In some ways, if we could answer this question, we could solve many of our animal welfare problems. I have the sense that quite a lot of farming practices are due to tradition. Farmers have done something a particular way. They've been told or taught that's the way something should be done, perhaps for good reason. So if someone's thinking about tail docking, they might think to themselves, well, I'm going to do this because it's going to reduce fly strike, for example, with sheep. But if we were able to encourage farmers to think more of the larger picture, things like, what are you feeding your sheep? Can you change what you're feeding them to alter the composition of the feces sufficiently so that there are fewer problems created by that? Or can you use other sort of veterinary interventions. So seeing the larger picture, thinking outside the box, it seems to me, is part of it. Also, as is happening at the moment, we could explore ways of focusing payments to farmers, which we rightly give them for maintaining our natural landscape and providing food for us in this country. Could we think of ways of structuring payments more to promote welfare rather than using most of payments indiscriminately just to give out money? Interested to see what Siobhan has to say on this.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, okay, I'll talk to that first then, and then perhaps to a wider point. So certainly I think it's a really interesting time with Brexit, having a big shake-up of how we're going to pay farmers, and essentially there are some things that currently the market is not really delivering that probably society does want. So, an end to some of these mutilations, as they're termed in the legislation, is one of them. For example, tail ducking of pigs is not allowed in organic schemes. It's discouraged under the RSPCA assured scheme, but still allowed and actually common. But that's only taking us so far. We've still got the vast majority of pigs tail docked in this country. And so this is something that potentially farmers could be paid for, because the reason that farmers are doing these things is basically that there's an economic incentive to do it. So if you can keep pigs in a more barren environment, you're saving on the costs of the rooting material and this other stuff, and essentially it makes economic sense to farmers to do it, and then that's why they've done it. So coming back, taking a step back from that, perhaps I guess is that the farming processes have kind of themselves developed into more and more, being more and more efficient at growing animals, particularly in quite barren environments. And that's, for example, the case for pigs. For pigs, we know the science is there. We don't need any more science on this. We know exactly what all the risk factors are. There've been umpteen studies. There's a huge pan-European report identifies over 100 risk factors. Number one risk factor is the environment, whether there's basically a rooting material for them or not. But there's a number of other risk factors as well. It's all quantified. But the reason it's not happening is because it costs money to do that. And it doesn't even cost a small amount of money in some instances. We're talking about whole system change, and that is massive. To suddenly not have slats because you want to have straw or something on it is really difficult. So I think taking a step back and thinking about what do we want, and then thinking about where would we want to go with these animals, and what are we prepared to pay for, and potentially it could come down to us all, the less and better type approach, so eating fewer animal protein products, but actually the ones that are there are higher welfare, and therefore farmer income is maintained, and basically if you pay farmers, they will grow it for you.
Great, thank you. And I think that also touches on a question that we've had about, but what about farmers' welfare? And perhaps that's something that we'll talk about more in the next webinar, actually, when we're talking about the cost of farmed animal welfare to the environment, to communities, and things. I wonder if I could sort of roll a couple of questions into one. One which is about the sort of how much of suffering is caused by over-selection on a set of genetic properties, and how much is caused by the environment, so what the interaction is there. And then an earlier question really about whether if animals have been bred for farming, why would they still miss foraging and dust bath? So why do they still have those genetic properties if they've been so kind of bred towards food production?
Yeah,
that's for either of you there.
Oh, shall I start by taking that? Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, and I think perhaps that it has come as a bit of a surprise when we've discovered really over the last 10-20 years that actually we haven't changed those really fundamental kind of behavioural characteristics, innate, I'll call them innate. You know, they're things that have developed over millennia and will take millennia to go away in natural circumstances. So things like, yeah, that desire to forage is just, you know, so strong in these animals because it's been so linked for so long to success in survival terms. I mean, it is possible we could breed them out. I think, you know, we're now understanding more about it. But then the next question is, do we want to do that? You know, are we really removing something that's fundamental? If we have pigs that no longer have any desire to root, are they still a pig as we know it? So, you know, that's, you know, I think a really fundamental ethical question.
Yeah,
and
perhaps that's a good point to ask for kind of David's sort of theological, ethical perspective on that, if I can.
Well, I guess it supports the notion that sort of animals do have natures, and these may be potentially malleable by us, but yes, if we want to change them, is a major ethical question, and why would we want to if it sort of contributes to the sort of diversity of our world sort of created by God? I mean, not only do animals display these sort of deeply rooted and deeply held predispositions, but farmed animals are also precocious, so they display some of these behaviours from a very early age. So if we think of sort of how early sort of calves or lambs can sort of stand up, so perhaps a calf standing up within half an hour. If you compare that with humans, animals are just so quick at these things, and sort of chicks developing sort of pecking behaviours. So these things are definitely not learned from the environment. They are sort of genetic and part of their natures, and we need to respect that. I mean, so far as breeding goes, I think we can use breeding for either to promote welfare or to harm it, even if the latter isn't the primary intention of particular breeding decisions. Decisions about breeding are typically taken, would be unsurprised to know, for sort of economic reasons, things to do with carcass quality as perceived by consumers. So I think we need to be bold about saying we need to breed for welfare rather than for economic or consumer preference.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm aware of time, and we're almost out of it. So yes, it's just up for me to say thank you very much to Siobhan and to David. Yeah, some really fascinating conversation there. Some really great questions. So thank you to everyone in the audience for questions. Just had another one there, which I'm afraid we're not going to have time to reply to. But do encourage you again to come along to future webinars on the 10th of March and 14th of April. Details of those are in the chat there. You can follow the link and book there with Margaret if you haven't done so already. Yeah, do keep in touch with us. Look forward to seeing you next time. And yeah, wish you all a super afternoon. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.